High in the folds of a mountain range where the clouds sank low and the rivers whispered secrets older than memory, there lay a village no map had ever marked. It was a place of green valleys and dark forests, where the wind carried the smell of damp earth and the cries of unseen birds echoed at dusk. To an outsider it might have seemed quiet, almost peaceful, but within its thatched roofs and smoke-stained hearths lived a fear that had lasted longer than the bloodlines of its people. It was the fear of the chief, and the story that had bound them to him for generations. The elders said it began long ago, when the rivers dried up and the forests turned barren, when children wasted away on hollow bellies and the hunters brought back nothing but broken arrows. The villagers prayed to the mountain spirits, to the gods of rain and stone, but no answer came until a stranger appeared, tall and cloaked, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. He called himself chief, though none knew from where he had come. He promised them fertility of fields, full bellies, and protection from plagues if they gave him what he desired. Once every generation, a maiden untouched by man, offered to him in a sacred binding. The first family that agreed wept even as they painted their daughter in red clay and walked her into the forest, but when she vanished into the chief's dwelling and the rains returned the next morning, the people silenced their doubt and began to call it salvation. So it continued, like the turning of the seasons. Every generation the drums beat their slow rhythm, the fires were lit in wide circles, and the chosen girl walked toward a fate none dared question. In return, their corn grew high, their animals multiplied, and storms spared their rooftops. The chief did not live among them as other men did. He did not laugh in the courtyards or sit at feasts. He lived apart, at the edge of the forest where the roots tangled and shadows pooled, and when he walked among the people it was with a stillness that made the air heavy. Some claimed he was no man at all but a spirit given flesh, others whispered that he had been cursed by the gods for an unspeakable crime. Yet no one dared ask, for his presence alone was enough to silence the tongue. Children were raised on this story, lulled to sleep by mothers who rocked them beside the fire and warned them not to stray near the chief's dwelling. When the wind howled through the trees they said it was his voice, and when shadows lengthened strangely on the ground they told one another he was watching. The young men who sharpened their spears and dreamed of rebellion spoke bravely by day but grew quiet by night, for none wished to test the bargain that kept their bellies full. And so the tradition held, as tight and unyielding as the roots of the mountain itself. On the eve of each offering, the village stirred with both dread and reverence. Women ground maize into flour while their hands trembled, men carved masks of wood painted in white and black to ward off jealous spirits. The air filled with the smoke of burning herbs, bitter and sweet, curling toward the stars. At dusk, the drummers began, slow at first, then faster, until the sound mimicked the heartbeat of the earth itself. Villagers gathered in a wide circle, wearing masks that made them faceless, for it was said the spirits grew hungry if they looked upon too many unguarded faces at once. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, half curious, half afraid, as the flames licked higher and shadows danced against the huts. In the center stood the maiden, always dressed in white woven from cotton spun during the winter months, always adorned with garlands of river lilies. Her hair was oiled and combed until it gleamed, and her skin painted with sacred ochre. The chants rose around her, voices weaving into a song older than any living elder, a song that spoke of duty, of sacrifice, and of the blessing that followed. Yet beneath the words lingered something unspoken, grief, loss, the ache of surrender. For though the village owed its survival to the bargain, every parent who watched knew they might one day be the ones to give their daughter away. The chief would arrive as the last drumbeats faded. He never came early, never lingered late. Tall, cloaked in garments of animal hide and bone, he stepped into the firelight with a stillness that froze the air. His face was hidden, either by mask or by shadow, and his voice, when he spoke the ritual words, echoed as though the earth itself carried it. The maiden was placed before him, and with no ceremony beyond the silence that followed, he led her away into the forest. By dawn, he returned alone, standing at the edge of the village long enough for all to see him. Then he vanished into his dwelling again, leaving behind silence, and the first signs of prosperity that would soon follow. No one spoke of what happened within those 3 nights she was given to him. No mother dared ask, no father dared pursue. But sometimes, on still nights when the air was heavy and the moon hid behind clouds, faint cries could be heard from the direction of his dwelling. The people told themselves it was the wind in the branches or animals in the brush. They told themselves that the girl became his bride, that she walked beside him as spirit wife in some hidden paradise. Yet others whispered darker things. They whispered that the ground near his home was too fertile, the grass too green, the animals too fat. They whispered that the chief did not eat at the feasts because he had other nourishment. They whispered, but never aloud where his shadow might hear. And so the years became decades, the decades centuries, until the story was no longer just a tale but the spine of the village's existence. It was no longer questioned, only obeyed, as inevitable as the rain or the frost. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the masks and songs and fires, the fear remained. Fear that one day the chief would not be satisfied. Fear that one day the sacrifice would not be enough. Fear that the bargain was not a blessing, but a curse disguised as mercy. And always, in the silence of the night, when the drums had ceased and the smoke had drifted away, that fear settled heavy on the hearts of the people, a weight passed from parent to child, from elder to youth. For they all knew, though none would speak it, that blessings which come through blood are never blessings at all. Her name was Ayumi, the daughter of a farmer whose hands were thick with callus and a mother whose voice carried the songs of planting and harvest. She was not the most beautiful of the village girls, though her eyes held a quiet depth, like pools that reflected more than they revealed. Her laughter was rare but true, and when it came, it carried through the air like a bird's call at dawn. Ayumi had dreams larger than the valley that cradled her home. She wished to see the world beyond the mountain ridges, to follow the river until it met the endless sea she had heard of only in stories. At night, she often climbed the slopes behind her family's hut to watch the stars scatter across the sky and imagined that each one was a path leading her somewhere far away. Yet dreams meant little in a place where tradition pressed heavier than stone, and when her name was spoken by the elders, the path she had hoped for vanished into silence. The choice was not hers. It had never been any maiden's. The elders gathered with solemn faces, and the chief's shadow seemed to stretch even into their words as they pronounced her fate. Her mother wept quietly, clutching her daughter's hands as though by holding them tightly she could anchor Ayumi to life itself. Her father's jaw clenched, his silence a mask for the storm within him. They knew what refusal meant. Refusal meant crops withering in the fields, children struck by fevers, cattle dead by mourning. Refusal meant ruin not only for their family but for all who shared their land. And so, though their hearts bled, they bowed their heads and accepted, as generations had before them. The house grew heavy with grief in the days that followed. Ayumi's younger brother refused to meet her gaze, ashamed both of his helplessness and of the relief that it was not he who had been chosen. Her mother tried to hum the old lullabies, but her voice broke into sobs before the songs could find their endings. Her father worked long hours in the fields, his body bent low, as though burying himself in toil could keep him from the thought of losing his child. Ayumi, for her part, remained quiet. She felt fear coil in her stomach like a living thing, but she also felt an odd calmness, as though she had always known this fate would come for her, just as it had come for so many before. The preparations began at dawn. Women came to her house, elder women with lined faces and practiced hands. They stripped her of the clothes she had worn since childhood and led her to the river where the mist curled low over the water. There, they bathed her, washing her hair with crushed herbs that smelled sharp and bitter, scrubbing her skin until it glowed pale in the early light. They murmured blessings under their breath, though Ayumi could hear the cracks in their voices, the tremor of pity that slipped through the ritual. When the bathing was finished, they painted her body with ochre and white clay, drawing symbols on her arms and legs meant to protect her spirit as it crossed from the world of mortals to the unknown realm of the chief. Back in the hut, the seamstresses dressed her in the ceremonial garments, a robe of white cotton, woven for this purpose alone, with a sash dyed in the blue of river stones. Around her neck they draped garlands of lilies gathered from the riverbank, their petals heavy with dew. Her hair, now gleaming and fragrant, was braided with threads of gold and bound with feathers from a heron caught at dawn. Each gesture, each ornament, was heavy with meaning, purity, sacrifice, honor, surrender. Yet to Ayumi, it felt as though they were weaving her into a shroud, binding her body for a burial she was forced to walk into while still alive. When the sun fell toward evening, the drums began. Their rhythm carried through the village, calling every soul to the open circle where the fires had already been lit. Men in carved masks took their places, women holding bowls of offerings stepped forward, and children pressed against their mothers' sides, wide-eyed and whispering. The air thickened with smoke from burning herbs, the scent both sweet and suffocating. In the center of the circle stood Ayumi, her robe gleaming in the firelight, her face painted with a mask of calm she did not feel. The villagers watched her with a mix of emotions that no chant could disguise. Some gazed with envy, as though being chosen was a strange form of honor, a pathway to a divine union beyond their reach. Others looked on with fear, as though they could not bear to imagine themselves in her place. Still others averted their eyes altogether, guilt eating at them, knowing they benefited from a sacrifice none dared resist. Yet no one spoke against it. No one stepped forward to shield her. The circle of silence was stronger than the flames that crackled between them. Then the drumming ceased. The fire hissed and crackled in the sudden stillness, and a shiver passed through the crowd. From the shadowed edge of the forest, he came. The chief. Tall, cloaked, a figure that seemed both human and more than human. His robes shimmered with the dull gleam of bone ornaments, his shoulders draped with pelts that belonged to no creature the villagers could name. His face was hidden, swallowed by the darkness of his hood, but his presence struck like a physical force, making hearts stumble in their chests. He spoke, and the sound of his voice was unlike any voice Ayumi had ever known. It was deep, yes, but layered, as though many voices spoke together, echoing through one body. It was the voice of man and shadow, of spirit and beast entwined. The words he uttered were the ancient ones of the ritual, words that commanded obedience rather than invited it. The people bowed their heads as one, trembling under the weight of the sound. Ayumi stood, her hands bound in front of her with a cord of woven grass, and met his shadowed gaze. For the first time, fear rose in her, not like a coiling serpent but like a river breaking its banks, flooding every part of her. She did not know if she would walk or be dragged, if she would live or vanish, if the stories of spirit brides were true or only lies to soften the truth. All she knew was that the chief's presence swallowed the world, and as he reached out to claim her, the firelight bent and wavered, as though even the flames themselves were afraid. The path into the forest was narrow and dark, the kind of path that seemed to shift beneath the eyes, bending and twisting so that no one but the chief could know it well. The villagers had lit torches at the edge of the clearing, but none dared to follow beyond the boundary where the firelight ended. They bowed low, their faces hidden behind painted masks, and watched in silence as Ayumi walked into the blackness at the chief's side. Her bound hands trembled before her, her breath uneven, though she forced herself to keep her steps steady. Behind her, the drums had fallen quiet, and ahead of her, the forest opened into shadow thick as smoke. The chief said nothing at first. His stride was long and fluid, his cloak whispering against the undergrowth, and she struggled to keep pace. Though he seemed not to touch her, she felt his presence like a hand pressed against her back, urging her forward. Strange lights flickered in the corners of her vision as they went, fireflies, perhaps, though their glow was too steady, too deliberate. The deeper they went, the more the sounds of the village faded until there was nothing but the beating of her heart and the rustle of unseen things in the trees. At last they came to a clearing where a dwelling rose from the earth like something grown rather than built. It was larger than any hut in the village, its frame made of massive timbers carved with twisting shapes that seemed to shift when Ayumi tried to look at them. Skins of animals, some familiar, some disturbingly strange, hung across its sides, and bones gleamed in patterns along the doorway. The roof was high, shingled with overlapping layers of bark that glistened as though slick with dew or blood. Smoke curled faintly from a vent at the top, carrying with it the smell of herbs, charred wood, and something metallic that made Ayumi's stomach tighten. The chief stopped at the entrance and turned to her. Though his face was shadowed beneath the hood, she felt the weight of his gaze. He lifted a hand and, with fingers long and pale, unbound the cord at her wrists. His touch was cool but not cruel, and when the grass cord slipped to the ground, Ayumi felt a surge of unexpected relief. He gestured, and though he spoke no word, she understood she was to step inside. Her feet carried her across the threshold with the slow inevitability of a dream. The interior was vast, larger than seemed possible from outside. Fire pits glowed low in the corners, their smoke venting upward through hidden shafts, casting the space in a deep red haze. Furs lined the floor, soft but smelling of musk and damp earth. Wooden pillars rose high, carved with spirals and faces whose eyes seemed to follow her. Along the walls hung masks, dozens of them, each different, some human, some beast, some twisted mixtures of both. Their hollow stares unsettled her, yet she could not look away. In the center of the dwelling was a low table carved from a single slab of stone, its surface polished to a sheen. Upon it sat bowls filled with fruit, dried meat, and steaming broth. The chief gestured for her to sit. His movements were deliberate, almost graceful, his hands speaking what his mouth withheld. When she lowered herself onto the fur cushions before the table, he took the place across from her. For the first time, she dared to truly look at him. He pulled back his hood just enough that the firelight grazed his features. His face was pale, strikingly so, the skin smooth and almost luminous. His hair fell long and dark around his shoulders, and his eyes, deep, unfathomable, seemed to shift color with the flames, now gold, now red, now a shade too dark to name. He was not as monstrous as she had feared, yet not entirely human either. There was a stillness to him, a quiet too deep to belong to a man. "You may eat," he said at last, his voice soft but resonant, carrying an echo that stirred the hairs on her neck. She realized with a start that it was the first time he had addressed her directly. Hesitant, Ayumi reached for a piece of fruit, a slice of something that looked like pear but tasted richer, sweeter, as though it had absorbed the sun itself. She ate slowly, her eyes darting to him. He made no move toward the food. He only watched her, his gaze unwavering, as though studying not her body but her soul. She took another bite, more from unease than hunger, and still he watched. "You do not eat?" she asked, her voice small in the vastness of the hall. His lips curved in what might have been the shadow of a smile. "I eat when I must. Nothing more." She lowered her eyes, heart thudding. A strange mixture of relief and dread filled her. He was not cruel, not the ravening monster her nightmares had painted him. Yet his calmness was unnerving, his silence heavier than threats would have been. When the meal was done, he rose and led her to a smaller chamber at the back of the dwelling. The walls here were lined with woven mats, the air thick with incense. A bed of furs lay at the center, more opulent than anything Ayumi had known. He gestured again, and she understood this was where she was to rest. He did not touch her, did not force her, only lingered long enough to see that she lay down before he left her alone. The door closed with a thud that echoed through her bones. Sleep did not come easily. She lay on the furs, staring at the shadows that flickered along the walls. The incense was cloying, almost sweet to the point of nausea. She listened to the silence, broken only by the crackle of distant fire pits. And then, as her eyes began to drift shut, she heard it. At first it was faint, a scratching, like claws against wood. Her breath caught, and she sat upright. The sound came from beyond the door, deliberate, slow, dragging along the grain. Then came whispers, too soft to understand, yet unmistakably. Voices, layered and echoing, as though a crowd murmured on the other side. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound seemed to seep through her skin. Her chest tightened, and she whispered a prayer to the river spirits, the only word she could recall through her fear. The scratching stopped. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. She lay back down, trembling, and tried to convince herself it had been her imagination, the residue of fear. But then came the breathing. Low at first, then deeper, heavier, as though some great beast crouched just beyond the threshold. She could feel it in the air, hot and damp, pushing against the mats that covered the walls. It lasted minutes, or perhaps hours, time dissolved in her terror, before fading away as suddenly as it had begun. When morning came, pale light seeping through unseen cracks, she rose to find the chief waiting outside her chamber. He stood motionless, as though he had been there all night. His expression gave nothing away. He asked no questions, offered no explanations. Only gestured for her to join him again at the stone table where breakfast had been laid. Once more, he urged her to eat. Once more, he did not touch the food himself. He only watched, his eyes never leaving hers, as though seeking something hidden beneath her surface. She forced herself to swallow the fruit, though her throat ached with the memory of the night's whispers. Far away, back in the village, the people danced and feasted. They poured wine and roasted meat, singing songs of abundance and protection. They told one another that the sacrifice had been accepted, that the chief and his bride were together now, and that prosperity was secured for another generation. They laughed louder than usual, perhaps to drown the unease that lingered at the edges of their joy. Mothers clutched their children, fathers drank deeply, and the elders nodded, satisfied that the tradition had been honored. No one spoke of the girl who now sat in the chief's dwelling, staring at a man who did not eat, listening for sounds that might return when darkness fell. The day passed in a haze for Ayumi. The chief spoke little, though when he did, his words were measured, his tone unexpectedly gentle. He asked of her family, of her childhood, of the games she played by the river. His knowledge of her village was uncanny. He knew names she had not spoken aloud, events she thought forgotten. When she asked how he knew these things, he only smiled that half smile and said, "I listen." His presence was at once comforting and unsettling, like a fire that warmed but might at any moment burn. As the sun sank and shadows stretched long once more, Ayumi felt her dread coil again. The memory of the scratching, the whispers, the heavy breathing pressed on her chest. The chief rose and led her back to the chamber, just as he had before. His gestures were calm, his voice soft as he bade her rest. And as she lay down upon the furs, she wondered if kindness could be a mask as easily as cruelty. For though he spoke gently, though he had touched her not at all, though he had watched her with eyes that seemed almost human, she could not forget that he had not eaten. He had only watched. And somewhere, in the silence after he left, the scratching began again. The second night came cloaked in a stillness that pressed against the trees, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Ayumi sat once more at the stone table, the bowls of fruit and meat spread before her, though she touched them reluctantly, her body still heavy from the broken sleep of the night before. The chief sat across from her, as unmoving as stone, his pale hands folded before him, his eyes steady and unreadable. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried a softness that surprised her. "There was once a tribe," he began, his gaze fixed not on her but on the firelight that danced along the carved pillars. "A tribe that lived beneath the shadow of these mountains, long before your people came. They were strong, clever, blessed by the spirits of the earth and sky. The rivers bent to their will, the forests gave them abundance, and even the storms parted when they sang. Yet they grew proud. They thought themselves greater than the ones who had given them life. They betrayed the spirits, and in their arrogance, they broke the bond that bound them to the land." Ayumi sat very still, her food forgotten. His voice was like a thread pulling her into the story, low and measured, carrying the weight of something more than memory. "The spirits punished them," he continued. "They took away the warmth of the sun, the gentleness of the rivers, the kindness of the earth. Hunger came, sickness followed, and the tribe dwindled. The few who remained were marked so they would never forget the cost of betrayal. Their bodies carried the strength of man and beast alike, but their souls were bound in hunger. They were doomed to wander between worlds, never fully one thing, never fully the other." He paused then, his eyes flicking to hers for the briefest moment, and Ayumi felt a chill despite the fire's glow. She wanted to ask if he was speaking of himself, if his tribe had been cursed and if he bore the mark even now. But his gaze, deep and restless, stilled her tongue. Instead, she asked softly, "Do you pity them?" For the first time, he smiled, not the faint, shadowed smile she had seen before, but something gentler, more human. "How can I not? They were my ancestors. Their blood runs in me. Their curse binds me still." Ayumi's breath caught. She searched his face, looking for some hint of cruelty, some trace of the monster the villagers whispered about. Yet in that moment, she saw only sorrow, as though the weight of centuries pressed upon him. She wondered if he, too, longed for something beyond the boundaries of the forest, beyond the chains of the ritual that tied him to her people. For a fleeting instant, her fear loosened. She thought, perhaps, he was misunderstood. Perhaps the chief was not a beast who devoured maidens but a spirit condemned by forces greater than himself. She even thought she glimpsed loneliness in him, a hunger not for flesh but for something lost, companionship, forgiveness, release. But when the night deepened, and she was led again to her chamber, that fragile hope withered. The scratching began earlier this time, sharper, more insistent, like claws raking across the wood with furious impatience. Ayumi pressed her hands to her ears, whispering prayers, but the sound grew louder, joined by growls that rumbled low and guttural. The whispers she had heard the night before returned, yet now they were harsher, broken by snarls and hisses. Her body shook as she curled on the bed of furs, her heart racing with the rhythm of the sounds. When at last she drifted into sleep, her dreams were no escape. She dreamed of teeth, rows upon rows of them, jagged and red, snapping shut in the darkness. She dreamed of shadows stretching long, swallowing the ground beneath her feet, binding her until she could not move. She dreamed of rivers, but they ran not with water but with blood, staining her hands, her robe, her very skin. In her dream, she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the growls that rose around her. She woke with a cry, her body damp with sweat, the fur beneath her clinging to her skin. The noises had ceased, leaving only silence, but the air carried a heavy stench, coppery and thick, as though blood had soaked into the very walls. When she stumbled from the chamber at dawn, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, she saw the chief waiting, just as he had before. His calm face betrayed nothing of what had happened in the night. He led her outside, and for the first time, Ayumi saw what lay beyond the dwelling's threshold. The villagers had come in the dark hours, leaving their offerings at the edge of the clearing. Goats, chickens, and even a young calf lay bound when the night began, their cries echoing through the forest. Now, in the pale light of morning, nothing remained but bones slick with blood, scattered across the earth as though devoured by something that left no trace of flesh behind. The air reeked of it, sharp and metallic, clinging to her throat. Ayumi's stomach turned, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. The chief looked at the remains without expression, as if the sight were as ordinary to him as the sunrise. When he turned to her, his eyes seemed darker than before, reflecting the red-stained ground. "Your people honor the bond," he said quietly. "And the spirits are pleased." Ayumi could not answer. The whispers of pity she had felt for him, the fragile hope of his tenderness, now lay tangled with dread. She wondered if the curse he spoke of demanded more than sorrow, if hunger itself lived in his blood. And though he looked at her with the calmness of a man, she could not banish the image of teeth and shadows from her mind. For the first time, she thought that the villagers' silence, their bowed heads, their trembling reverence, might not come only from tradition. Perhaps they, too, had heard the scratching. Perhaps they, too, had smelled the blood. And perhaps they knew the chief's true form was never far from the surface, waiting for the night when restraint would finally break. The third night settled over the forest with a weight unlike the others, as though even the air feared to move. The fires in the clearing burned lower, the drums had ceased long before, and the villagers had already retreated to their homes, certain the bond was secure. But inside the chief's dwelling, Ayumi felt the tension coil tighter with every passing moment. The chief did not sit with her at the stone table as he had before, nor did he ask her to eat. He paced the length of the great hall, his cloak whispering across the furs, his pale hands clenched and unclenched in restless silence. His stillness, once unsettling, was now gone. In its place was something jagged, raw, as if his very body strained against invisible bonds. His skin seemed to ripple beneath the firelight, shifting in ways that made Ayumi's eyes ache to follow. Shadows clung to him unnaturally, stretching longer than the flames could explain. When at last he turned toward her, his eyes caught the light, not in the soft flicker of amber or gold as before, but in a sudden blaze of red, glowing from within as if some furnace had been lit behind them. Ayumi's breath caught in her throat. He looked at her as though he were both man and stranger, as though something greater and more terrible stared through the fragile mask of flesh. She shrank back, her heart racing, and the faint hope that he might be misunderstood, that he might be tender, shattered like brittle clay. "I have tried," he said, his voice deeper now, layered with the echo of many voices. "I have held the hunger back. But the third night always comes." His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. The stone groaned beneath his strength, cracks splintering across its surface. His cloak fell aside, and Ayumi saw the change ripple through him, his limbs lengthening, bones bending, shoulders hunching as if forced beneath a weight too great to bear. His skin darkened, splitting and stretching, and from the rents in his flesh sprouted coarse hair, scales, and something darker still, shadows that seemed to crawl outward as if alive. His face twisted, the smoothness tearing apart, jaws lengthening, teeth jutting forward in grotesque rows that gleamed wetly in the firelight. The sound of his transformation filled the hall, bones snapping, tendons stretching, a guttural growl that rose and deepened until it shook the very pillars. His eyes blazed brighter, no longer human, burning with hunger that words could not mask. When his scream came, it was no human cry but the roar of a beast and the hiss of a serpent, layered with the moan of shadows tearing loose from the earth. Ayumi staggered back, her legs weak beneath her. She realized then, with a horror that rooted her to the spot, that the villagers must have known. They must have heard the scratching, the growls, the whispers carried through the trees. They must have seen the bones left behind, the blood staining the earth. They knew, and yet they gave their daughter still, silenced by fear and bound by tradition. Her family had known, the elders had known, and still they had painted her in white and led her into his hands. The beast advanced, its shape shifting with every step, wolf's fur bristling along a hunched back, serpent's coils sliding where legs had been, and shadow pooling beneath it like liquid night. Its breath came hot and fetid, carrying the copper sting of blood. Its teeth gnashed, snapping the air, as drool hissed against the stone. The firelight flickered wildly, as though shrinking from the sight, throwing jagged patterns across the walls where masks seemed to grimace in shared terror. Ayumi screamed, the sound piercing the vast hall, but no one would come. No villager would cross the forest now. She stumbled toward the chamber's edge, desperate to flee, but even as she moved, the attendants who had guarded the dwelling appeared, men masked, armed with spears tipped in obsidian. They had come not to protect her, but to ensure she remained. Yet when they saw the beast, even they faltered. The chief, or what had once been him, lunged. One guard raised his spear, but the creature's jaws snapped it in half as though it were straw, then closed around the man's torso. The crunch of bone, the scream cut short, and the spray of blood painted the furs and pillars. Another guard thrust his weapon into the beast's side, but the shadows swallowed it, and the serpent's coils whipped out, crushing the man until his ribs cracked like dry wood. Ayumi's shrieks mingled with theirs, echoing through the chamber in a chorus of terror. The fire roared higher as though feeding on the carnage, its light flashing across the beast's form as it tore through flesh and bone. Blood spattered the stone table, steaming as it touched the heated bowls, mingling with the fruits that lay uneaten. Shadows writhed across the walls, stretching long fingers that seemed to clutch and squeeze with every bite the monster took. The air grew thick with the stench of iron and smoke, choking Ayumi as she pressed herself against the farthest wall, her nails tearing at the mats that lined it. One by one, the attendants fell, their cries silenced beneath the snapping of jaws, the grinding of bone between monstrous teeth. Limbs were flung aside, ribs split open, skulls shattered against the stone floor. Silence followed each death, brief and suffocating, broken only by the wet sounds of feeding. Ayumi covered her ears, her body trembling, her throat raw from screams that tore themselves free no matter how she tried to stifle them. And then, silence. The beast stood in the center of the hall, its body shifting, its skin crawling with shadows that bled into the floor. Blood dripped from its jaws, steaming as it fell onto the stone, and the firelight flickered, weaker now, as though drained by the slaughter. The corpses lay twisted and broken, their eyes staring sightless at the ceiling, their mouths open in frozen terror. Ayumi could not move. Her body refused to obey, paralyzed by the certainty that any motion would draw the beast's attention. Yet even in stillness, she knew she could not escape. Its eyes, glowing from within the shifting darkness, found hers. They burned with hunger, with inevitability, with the same force that had bound her people for generations. The silence that followed was worse than the screams, worse than the growls. It was the silence of inevitability, the silence of a curse that no prayer could break, the silence that waited only for the beast to finish what it had begun. And in that silence, Ayumi understood at last. The bargain was never about blessing, never about prosperity. It was only about feeding the hunger that could not die. The fire sputtered. The shadows closed in. And the beast devoured. The sun crept reluctantly into the valley, its first rays washing the treetops with gold while the forest floor remained damp and shadowed. From the outside, the chief's dwelling looked unchanged, its carved mask staring blankly as smoke curled faintly upward from the fire within. Yet the silence surrounding it was unnatural. The night's violence left no trace, no torn bodies, no broken spears, no screams lingering on the air. The great hut was empty, swept clean as though the darkness itself had consumed every drop of blood and carried it away. When the chief emerged, he looked once again like a man. His cloak hung heavy around his tall frame, and his hair, loose and dark, gleamed faintly with dew. Yet his robes betrayed him, stiff with dried blood, stained in thick patches along the hem and sleeves. His hands bore the same faint maroon crust, and his mouth, though clean, seemed raw, as though freshly scoured. Still, when the villagers glimpsed him, they bowed low, pressing their foreheads to the earth. None dared to ask questions. None dared to look too long at the stains. By midday, whispers spread. The fields, long thirsty from an unseasonable drought, seemed to glisten with sudden moisture, dew clinging to every blade of grass. Shoots that had withered days before now stood upright, heavy with green. The river, usually clear, ran red for several hours, not thick like blood but tinged as though some unseen hand had stirred iron into the water. Fish leapt at the surface in numbers unseen for years. Children who had been fevered with sickness woke with color in their cheeks. Goats birthed twin kids where only one had been expected. The sacrifice was accepted, the people murmured. They said it with relief, some with awe, a few with unease. The oldest among them spoke with certainty, the spirits are pleased. For in their eyes, what followed each offering was proof that the curse, though dark, was also a kind of covenant. And so they sang again, not in mourning but in gratitude. The women gathered at the river to wash garments, humming the old chants as they watched the crimson water fade back to clear. Men returned to their fields with vigor, turning the soil, planting new seeds, laughing as if fortune had returned. Children skipped along the paths, tossing flowers, unburdened by knowledge of the night. Life resumed, brightened, gilded by prosperity purchased at an unseen cost. But not all hearts celebrated. In the small house at the edge of the village, the maiden's family sat in silence. Her father, a man whose back had bent from years of toil, stared long at the earth, his hands gripping the table as though to steady himself against waves only he could feel. Her mother, once proud and stern, wore her hair unbound, grey strands falling into her eyes as she sat by the hearth, unmoving. Her younger brother asked no questions, though he woke in the night calling her name, his small voice breaking the darkness. They did not weep publicly. Grief was dangerous when the eyes of tradition watched. To question, to mourn too openly, was to insult the bargain that bound them all. And so their mourning became a quiet thing, a spoon left untouched at the table, a robe folded carefully in a chest, the faintest whisper of her name when no one else could hear. Their silence was their rebellion, though it would never be recognized as such. Neighbors passed by, offering words that were meant to console but carried the weight of indifference. "Your daughter was chosen," they said. "She brought blessing to us all." Some even smiled as they said it, pride glinting in their eyes, as though the maiden's death was not tragedy but honor. The family bowed in return, their faces unreadable, their words practiced. Only when the neighbors left did their silence grow heavier, thick with the grief they dared not voice. At night, when the drums were still and the fires burned low, they thought they heard it, the faintest scratching at the edge of the forest, like claws raking against stone. The brother stirred, clutching at his mother's robe, whispering, "She is calling." But the mother only hushed him, stroking his hair, though her own heart trembled. For she, too, heard the whispers, soft as breath, threading through the trees. The village would not name it. To them, the scratching was nothing but the wind, the whispers no more than rustling leaves. They turned their ears away, choosing to hear only the laughter of children and the rustle of grain ripening too quickly in the fields. But the family knew. The family always knew. And still, they bowed their heads when the elders passed. Still, they joined the chants at the festivals. Still, they tended the soil, drew water from the river, and ate the bread that was richer now than it had ever been. They lived, bound by the tradition that had devoured their daughter, and dared not imagine a world where silence could be broken. For in this village, silence was survival. Generations passed, as generations always do. The faces that once wept for the maiden turned to dust, and the children who once played in the crimson river grew old and bent, their hair silvering under the mountain winds. Yet the story of that night, the third night, when the chief revealed his true form, did not vanish. It rippled outward like the rings of water after a stone's fall, carried on the voices of mothers and grandmothers, of hunters by the fire, of masked dancers in the ceremonies that returned with each season. The children heard it first as a bedtime tale. Their mothers would hush them with it when the night grew restless, saying, "If you do not listen, if you do not obey, the chief will come for you, and you will hear his claws at your door." Their fathers, carving wood by the hearth, would add, "Respect the bargain, or the curse will return, and the fields will wither." Some children laughed, wide-eyed but unafraid, daring one another to creep near the chief's dwelling and listen for the whispers. Others trembled and pulled their blankets tighter, convinced that in the rustle of the wind they already heard his growl. Yet as the years stretched into decades, the tale grew restless too, changing as all folktales must. Some versions softened, others darkened. Some said the maiden was chosen because she was the purest among them, her heart full of courage, her spirit too bright to ignore. Others said she was unlucky, a girl cursed from birth, marked by shadows no one else could see. Still others whispered that she went willingly, stepping into the chief's arms with love in her eyes, choosing to sacrifice herself so that her people might live. Children argued over the truth, some claiming she was devoured screaming, others that she became part of him, fused into the darkness so that her voice lingered in the scratching on the walls. The elders, when asked, never answered clearly. They sat in the council circle, faces hidden behind masks, and reminded the young that the story was not for curiosity but for instruction. What matters, they said, is not how she went, but what was given. And what must be given still. In time, the maiden became less a girl of flesh and bone and more a symbol. Her name faded, worn away by years until only fragments of it remained on the tongues of the oldest. She was not a Yumi anymore, but the chosen one, the offering, the white bride of the chief. In songs, she was sung as a flower plucked too early, as a dove caged by fate, as firewood thrown to the hearth so that others might eat their bread in warmth. In dances, masked figures circled the fire while one, painted in white clay and crowned with feathers, was led away into the shadows beyond the drums. Children watched wide-eyed as the dancer vanished, and though they knew it was only ritual, their hearts thudded with unease, for on certain nights the wind carried back what sounded like muffled cries. Through these retellings, lessons bloomed. The first was simple, repeated often, almost comforting. Prosperity always demands a price. The villagers pointed to the fields, heavy with grain, and said, "See? This is the gift of her sacrifice. Without it, the earth would wither, and our bellies would starve." Parents reminded their children that plenty was never free. Every loaf of bread, every cluster of fruit, was bound by blood. And though the young frowned, uneasy with the thought, they nodded, for the evidence lay before them in every harvest. The second lesson was quieter, whispered only in the corners of houses or between lovers at night. Silence itself was dangerous. The maiden's family had bowed their heads, their grief swallowed by tradition, and in their silence the curse had continued. Some whispered that if they had risen, if they had shouted, if they had broken the chain, perhaps the offering would have ended. But others argued the opposite, that silence had saved the village from the beast's hunger spreading unchecked. The truth blurred, and so the warning became double-edged. Silence may protect you, or it may bind you to evil forever. Children carried this paradox with them into adulthood, never certain whether their obedience was strength or cowardice. And then there was the lesson most feared. the veil between man and beast is thin, thinner than the skin that covers bone. The chief had seemed kind, even sorrowful, before his hunger unmasked him. His tenderness was not false, but it was not enough to quell what lurked beneath. Parents used this lesson when speaking of strangers, or even of neighbors whose eyes burned too brightly. Beware, for within any man the beast may wait. You cannot always tell until the third night. And so suspicion wove itself into the fabric of life. People watched each other carefully, listening for the scrape of claws in laughter, the flicker of teeth in a smile. The story spread beyond the village in time, carried by traders and wanderers, reshaped by every tongue that told it. In one valley, they said the chief was not a man at all but a shadow-given form, who lured maidens only to drink their voices until the village was struck mute. In another, he became a serpent god who demanded brides so that his venom would not seep into the rivers. Elsewhere, the maiden was no longer a victim but a trickster who fed herself willingly to the beast, only to tear it apart from within. Each telling carried its own warning, suited to the fears of those who told it, but always the bones of the tale remained, the sacrifice, the hunger, the silence. Yet within the village where it began, the story never faded into pure myth. For the villagers claimed that the sign still returned, every generation. The crops still grew too quickly after a maiden's disappearance. The river sometimes carried a reddish hue in the spring. Goats birthed twins too often, children's fevers broke too suddenly, and the masks above the chief's hut seemed to grin too wide in the firelight. And always, there were the nights when the wind fell still, and scratching could be heard at the edge of the forest.